Press.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the Permanence Trust hosted by the American Forest Foundation. My name is Mikela Waldman, and I am the Senior Manager of Market Engagement at the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. And I'm also the Executive Secretariat Lead on the work that we do at the IC-VCM on permanence. Today, we'll hear from AFF's lead scientist, Lynn Riley, and Executive Vice President of Climate Funding, Nathan Truitt, about their newly developed concept that addresses non-permanence risks of carbon credits. First, we'll start off by seeing a short presentation from Lynn to introduce us to the trust. Then we'll discuss with Lynn and Nate the origin of this idea and some of the opportunities and challenges of implementing the trust across the market. Then we will open it up for questions. So as questions arise, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your question, and we will get to them during the Q&A portion of this webinar. Before I pass it over to Lynn, we are going to launch a poll question for all of you to answer while we get the presentation started. So you should see the poll coming up soon, and please take a moment to answer this question to the best of your ability. And now I will pass it over to Lynn.
Thanks, Mikela. Yeah, feel free to keep working on that poll, and I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Yeah, thanks again, Mikela, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're excited to just give a few more details about the Permanence Trust concept, and then are really interested in the questions that y'all might have for us. So I won't go over the agenda again because Mikela said that, but I'm just going to jump right in. And I know we have a variety of different stakeholders joining us today. So I did want to begin just with the definition of permanence that we are going to be utilizing, that we utilize in the paper, and then throughout this webinar as well. So for our purposes, we're thinking about permanence as the persistence of credited climate benefits, or sometimes referred to as carbon credits, in reservoirs out of the atmosphere for timescales that are meaningful to the emissions they are used to address. So I wanted to start here because some folks on this webinar might be a little bit even new to carbon credits. So when we talk about that, we're just talking about some sort of project activity that led to additionally sequestered and stored carbon that we have monitored and verified and then reported out in the form of a credit. And sometimes these carbon credits are used to address unabated or residual emissions. Those unabated emissions that these credits might be used to address can linger in the atmosphere and contribute to warming for centuries to millennia. And So while there's still somewhat of discourse out there in the market on what exactly is a meaningful time period for permanence, also even last week there was some great pieces out there about the concept of durability and how that can be a great addition to the concept of permanence and not have it be quite so black and white, but more of a spectrum of how long these carbon credits are persisting. For the purpose of our paper, we did utilize about a millennia as kind of the design criteria that we were trying to address. So that comes from our understanding that the emissions that carbon credits might be used to address can last in the atmosphere for multiple millennia. And so to be meaningful for that use case, we wanted to see if we could design some sort of permanence mechanism for carbon credits to see if they could meet that time scale. Also, American Forest Foundation is a carbon project developer, so we have had lots of conversations with the buyers of carbon credits and repeatedly have heard that kind of longer than decades to centuries is the bar that they hope projects can be designing to, or that mechanisms can design to. So we really set out when we were thinking about writing this paper or coming up with a new mechanism to meet that bar as what might be meaningful. All that being said, just want to recognize that there is still sort of discussion out there on how long is permanent. So yeah, we welcome that discussion as well. So with that, another thing I want to highlight here before I get into the actual trust itself is just that all carbon reservoirs have risk. So there's lots of different project types out there that people are doing today. So there's forest-based projects, which is what American Forest Foundation does, where we are improving the management of forests to sequester and store more carbon. There's reforestation, there's soil projects. Those things tend to fall, at least into this table that I took from a great FAO report from last fall, tend to fall in that lower right-hand quadrant of high reversal risk in terms of human-caused reversals and high reversal risk in terms of naturally caused reversals. So what I mean by that is forests are susceptible to reversal through forest fire. That might be a naturally caused reversal. They also might be susceptible to reversal due to timber markets or demand for timber increasing in a certain time period. So from kind of both those angles of people and natural systems, there's relatively high reversal risk in that sort of lower right quadrant of project types. There's lots of other different types of carbon projects that also have reversal risk, but those might tend to be a little bit lower in terms of either human-caused reversal risk, natural reversal risk, or both. So those are when we're actually getting carbon captured and stored in geologic reservoirs, maybe getting it stored into wood products, things like that. So I just wanted to make this point to say that all these reservoirs have reversal risk, but some certainly are more than others. And so that was kind of another thing we had in mind when we set out to think about a new permanence mechanism is, okay, what if we designed something for that lower right quadrant that has the relatively the highest reversal risk from all these different kinds of drivers, and if we can sort of tackle that, then hopefully we can also create something that works for these other quadrants as well that may have lower or even could be considered to have essentially no reversal risk. Also at the top here, I want to make it clear that as Nate and I have been working on this over the past few years, we certainly are nowhere near the first people to begin to think about this problem. And so you'll see, for those who might have read the concept paper, that we do spend a good amount of time just thinking about all of the really brilliant and innovative mechanisms for achieving the permanence of credited climate benefits that came before us. So we do have this table's copied from the paper, so you can read about it more in there. And I won't go through the details of all of these, but things like buffer pools, things like 10-year accounting, emissions liability management, These are all really great concepts. Several of these have been operationalized within carbon markets. Probably most prevalently, buffer pool mechanisms have. And with good reason, there's lots of benefits to these methods today. However, as you'll kind of see in our table, when we set about to think about what is really the market need for permanence today, and we sort of had these different columns of elements of a permanence mechanism that we've been hearing about in the market, we really didn't see anything out there that met all of those today. So we were thinking about things like there needs to be clear liability. So who's responsible at any given time for reversals that happen? Then once we know who's responsible, what is a mechanism for recourse when a reversal happens? Even when you kind of dig into some of these tools, there's not consistent definitions and length of permanence. Then kind of differentiation between project level permanence and credit level permanence. We also don't really have today any sort of operational long-term monitoring systems for how do we know when reversals are actually happening? How can we make sure that we have a monitoring system in place to identify them? We also were looking for incentives to prevent reversals, and then scalability. So just recognizing that if every project out there, or even every standard out there, or every buyer out there has to build their own unique bespoke system, that's probably not going to be scalable at the pace that we need for the climate mitigation that we need. So that was another sort of criteria for us. So while we see all of these as tools that certainly have strengths, we wanted to design something, or see if we could design something that really met all of those criteria. So that led us to this concept that you might have read about in the paper called the Permanence Trust. So in a succinct summary, essentially what we're talking about with the Permanence Trust is, while a lot of those mechanisms I just talked about predict how many credits to set aside today to make up for reversal risk that might be decades or centuries into the future, the Permanence Trust, as we envision it, would be an independent entity that models financial resources to set aside today that can grow and be actively used to manage reversal risk and ultimately retire the permanence responsibility. So just to give a sense of what that might look like, it could look like using this sort of pool of funds to actually do that long-term monitoring for the permanence of credited benefits. It could look like actively mitigating reversals. So let's say you're thinking about forest-based projects, that could be like taking action to reduce wildfire risk. It could be replacing reversals that have been identified with new credits, so compensating. It could be purchasing insurance policies to address temporary gaps. It could be investing in low to no reversal risk removal technologies. So if you think back to that table I showed earlier, taking some funds and investing them in that upper left-hand quadrant where you have relatively low risk. A lot of times those are also the technologies that are the least scaled today. So this could be a pool of funds to invest in that type of technology. And then ultimately fully retiring a millennia length permanence liability through purchasing credits that actually do achieve that more permanent geologic storage. So even if you're implementing a project that's in that lower right quadrant where you have the relatively high reversal risk, ultimately we want to retire that permanence liability through some sort of geologic storage. So our hope here is that this idea can kind of, like I said, build upon the most effective elements of all those mechanisms that have come before it and create a path to achieving that meaningful permanence for all types of carbon credits. Hopefully this creates a path to help us fund and invest those more permanent forms of carbon credits, even while implementing and scaling what's available to us today, which is often these nature-based projects. We also hoped to have something that could help us more consistently price permanence into carbon credits by sort of forcing the cost of permanence into the cost of credits. Also, we see this as a way to hopefully diversify the management of permanence risk across many different geographies and project types. It also allows us to have a really clear entity who's ultimately responsible for carrying out this retirement of a permanence liability or responsibility. So it's not necessarily unclear, is it the standard who's responsible, is it the project, is it the buyer, but it's really held by this independent entity. And then hopefully it's also something that's really scalable. So it's not something that has to be bespoke, like I said, to the buyer, the project, the standard, but something that could be looked at across the market. We even are seeing today as a project developer, when we recently did an exercise with some students at a university where we put our same exact project through the non-permanence risk tools of 6 or 7 different standards, and we were getting different estimates of our project's non-permanence risk over just 100 years by different standards by a margin of like roughly 20% variance, just depending on which non-permanence risk tool was used. So hopefully this can also be a way to just drive more consistency across the market of what is the risk, and then how can we actually manage it. So just a little bit more in how we sort of envision this working, although I'll say there's a lot to figure out. As you probably saw in the paper, we're just at the very beginning stage of getting this concept out there with a lot of work ahead of us. But let's say that you have a forest project represented in this graphic, and you're looking at your sort of landscape level carbon stock. Towards the left of this graph, that black line at the top might be the carbon performance in your project forests. You're going to be comparing that to some sort of baseline, which is represented here by sort of that white line. The delta between the black line and the white line is what you would get credited as a carbon credit throughout that sort of crediting period. What we're suggesting is that then after that, however, whatever volume of carbon is stored in that project reservoir, that project forest at the end of the crediting period, then becomes your sort of permanence period baseline. So that's that smaller white line right after the end of the crediting period. And so what we're proposing is that you would be, or this permanence trust entity would be monitoring for any time that that landscape level carbon stock fell below that permanence period baseline. That would be identified as a reversal and would trigger some sort of, like I said, a variety of approaches. Could be compensating with a credit. It could be fully retiring the permanence liability with a geologic storage type of credit. One thing to note here is that we're also proposing that even though forests can regenerate after reversals, that we would identify a reversal at the time it occurred. So you'll see we have a first reversal, which the Permanence Trust would then be liable to do something about. Then the forest recuperates. Maybe it actually goes above that permanence period baseline again. But even if it has the potential to do that, we still want to have addressed that reversal that did occur, and then maybe more reversals happen. So it can go up and down, but we're sort of proposing that reversals be addressed when they occur, even if the reservoir might regenerate. So last little bit here that I wanted to share is from the financial side of things for those who might be joining us from that angle. We did, as you might have seen in the paper, just conceptually illustrate a few financial assumptions. These very clearly are things that we're going to need to test and validate of whether these assumptions are reasonable. That is some work that we hope to do upcoming here soon. But we did just want to see, could this actually be a solvent financial mechanism based on a few actual project types. So I won't go through all of these assumptions, but we did build a model just to conceptually start to test this a little bit, where we assume a certain rate of return within the trust, a certain cost for the geologic storage that would ultimately retire the permanence liability. And then we looked at 3 different theoretical project types. So an agricultural project, an improved forest management project, and then an afforestation project. We varied the number of years that the project would be liable for the permanence of that credited carbon. Then we also made some assumptions about what we called the annual decay rate. By that, we just mean how much of the carbon stored by the project is being re-released into the atmosphere after that credit liability period. Then we sort of let the model tell us, okay, how much then would it cost per credit for us to pass on that liability to the Permanence Trust entity? And then ultimately what we were looking for is to see if by the end of 100 years, could we have fully retired that permanence liability for those different project types based on those assumptions. So I won't go into depth on these, but did just want to share that at least in this initial modeling, lots to validate, we did see that the trust was solvent and was able to fully retire the permanence liability at a millennia timescale for all of these different project types based on kind of those permanence per credit assessment prices. So we found that to be promising enough to at least write it all down in the paper and share it with you all. And there's still a lot more to figure out. So I'll skip through these, but yeah, all 3 project types at least were solvent under this set of assumptions. So there's lots of challenges and questions ahead that we ourselves don't know the answers to. So just to go through a few top lines here, lots would need to be done to actually establish this within the market and with standards. Lots of questions about, if this really needs to be a very long-term institution, what sort of legal structures can support that? What happens if the trust itself becomes insolvent? How are people thinking about the way that we've defined permanence and that reversal identification? What sort of long-term monitoring system could be developed for this use case? So all those questions, a lot more, lead us to hosting this webinar, and then an invitation to all of you on here today, or those who might be watching the recording. We'd love to get more folks involved. So a few ways that you can do that. You can please share any feedback you have. Those are my email and Nate's email on there. So we would love any feedback, and thank you to the many people who have given us feedback along the way as we developed the paper. We also have sent around a request for proposals for a bigger feasibility study. If you haven't seen that and you would be interested in submitting a proposal, a lot of that is going to look like helping us validate or see a path to how we could validate some of those key assumptions that I talked about. We have set a due date for proposals of the end of this month, but yeah, reach out to us if you would like to see that RFP. We also are, in tandem to that, planning to convene an expert advisory group to help us think through all the things that Nate and I are not experts on as we build out this idea. And then lastly, we at AFF are certainly not the only people thinking about this. So I just wanted to send an encouragement to also apply if you're interested in this type of thing to the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market's continuous improvement work programs, which sparked a lot of this idea in their first permanence working group, and they should have more coming as well. So great place to also get involved if you're interested. And with that, I think I'll pass it back to Mikela for some discussion.
Great. Thank you, Lynn, for that presentation. We will just jump right into the discussion then. So the first time I actually met Nate was also the first time I'd ever heard about this permanence trust concept. And this was back in January of 2024, sitting around a table at Cambridge University during a permanence workshop that was kind of a prelude to the IC-VCM formally launching our first continuous improvement work program on permanence. So to kick us off, Nate, can you take us back to that Cambridge workshop and speak to what was so unique about that experience and a bit on how much development of this permanence trust idea had happened before you had walked into that room, and then how it progressed during that workshop and how it has evolved since then?
Yeah, absolutely. So we at AFF had sort of been forced to contend with this because of the nature of the landowners we work with, who are small, private, non-industrial landowners. Traditionally, in nature-based projects, the way permanence had sort of been addressed is through just contract lengths, right? You sign a contract with a landowner for 100 years or 160 years, and they're kind of on the hook for maintaining the carbon stocks at the appropriate level. Small landowners just won't do that. It's a non-starter. So we immediately had this challenge of we can get a landowner to sign a 20-year contract, but we need to get to 1,000 years or 100 years or whatever. It's a lot more than 20. And so we had designed, actually Lynn came up with this idea of a permanence fund, which is basically like the permanence trust, but only for a project. And at the same time, I mean, this is how the voluntary carbon market has worked for years, right? It's like individual standards or project developers or buyers or whatever, they all come up with their kind of bespoke solution, which is fine until you're trying to scale the market or get it to really function within these high level frameworks. At which point you've got like apples and bananas and pineapples and oranges that you're trying to fit together. So the IC-VCM, seeing a lot of promising developments around the issue of permanence, invited people from all over the ecosystem, right? Government agencies, the developer of tech-based solutions, soil project developers, scientists who understood the physics behind this. I mean, everybody you can think of, economists, bankers, financiers, all to this meeting in Cambridge, where we were to basically brainstorm, for lack of a better word, right? Like, what are different things, different approaches that we could begin to think about and work on, and also so we could get clarity on what the problem is. So I remember very clearly the first session of that meeting, just as an example of the benefits of this sort of collaboration. Derek Brokoff of the Stockholm Environmental Institute gave an hour-long presentation about why permanence matters scientifically, right? Up until that point, I think like a lot of nature-based people had sort of thought of it like, yeah, 40, 100, 1,000. I mean, if we're worrying about this 100 years from now, it means that we succeeded in fighting climate change. Like, we don't have to worry about this stuff. And that presentation made me realize, nope, this is yet another example of how our generation can be passing along damages and obligations to future generations, and that is unacceptable to me, and I think to everyone in the room, right? So once we had clarity around that problem, we were able to discuss a lot of this and make a lot of progress on many ideas. This was one of them. There were others. The other thing I just want to say quickly is the fact that it was at Cambridge. So it was great for the IC-VCM to call all these groups together. That was great. But the setting itself was very important, because I remember the dinner we had jointly after our first introductory sessions was in one of these college mess halls that had existed in an institution for 800 years. So you're sitting there, you're talking to your colleagues about like, oh my gosh, how is it possible for any human institution to last 1,000 years? And then you just literally physically have to look up at the building you're in and you go, oh, okay, there must be some way to do it. So I think the inspiration of the setting was very important too. And unlike a lot of conferences that we all go to, there was clear follow-up from the IC-VCM, right? They organized the CIWP to take these ideas forward and further develop and further analyze them. So I think this is really interesting work in and of itself. I think it's also a really good blueprint for how we as a community need to solve these thorny problems heading forward, right? Get everyone together, have clear follow-ups. That's the way to go.
Thank you so much. That gives a lot of really helpful context, and it actually touches on something that I've noticed a lot in conversations with stakeholders across the market that's been really striking for me, which is that kind of regardless of people's background or where they sit in the market, there seems to be a real sense of excitement and openness towards this permanence trust concept. Lynn, from your perspective, why do you think that this idea has resonated so broadly?
Yeah, thanks, Mikela. I totally agree. Just as we've sort of put this concept out into the world, I've been sort of, I don't know if surprised is the right word, maybe pleasantly surprised that the feedback has been really positive, I would say. And to me, I think that's because it really does bring a lot of these different ideas together, both what has been tried in the past and the new things that people are working on. So there's kind of something for everybody, and it doesn't count out any of the awesome project activities that are already happening today. So that really was our intention, was to create a path that could work for all different types of climate solutions out there, as well as figuring out, okay, how could we help scale some of these more permanent solutions that are not quite scaled yet? How could we utilize natural climate solutions better? How can we utilize newer market tools like insurance? And so I really do see it as having a role for everybody. That's part of what's really cool too about having this diversified fund of money, is that we don't actually have to prescribe exactly how it gets used in any given year. It can be flexible to even some sort of market solution that we haven't thought of today, but someone thinks about 10 years from now. It kind of gives us that room to then have the money to do what makes sense when the time comes.
Yeah, I totally agree. So of course, while the concept does hold a lot of promise, you also outlined in your presentation several of the key challenges that will be associated with the permanence trust. Nate, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest hurdles that would need to be overcome for this permanence trust to become a viable solution?
Yeah, so every time I ask myself this question, I come up with a different top 5 list of things that make me anxious. So I'll give you my current top 5, and then tomorrow, if you ask me, to get a different one. But here they are. First of all, clarity around the definition of a reversal is absolutely critical, and I don't think we have it as a community. And some of the questions that are being asked by audience members are already getting at that. Secondly, how do you assess non-permanence risk, right? And what are the models that you use? You don't have to completely nail that, but you have to be in the right ballpark, or otherwise you're going to really overprice or underprice the risk, neither of which is particularly desirable. The definition of liability is really important. Right now, in the marketplace, you have these project crediting periods during which a project developer is liable. But we actually need to shift that to a credit liability period, right? So in other words, when you issue a credit, you have to stand behind that specific credit for a certain period of time, rather than a project liability period where you might issue a credit in the last year of the project cycle, and in effect you're liable for only 1 year, right, for that before it transfers. So just getting all those definitions accepted and relatively uniform, not that they're all going to be the same level, but that everyone has those definitions in their various standards. That was number 3. Number 4 is the issue of solvency. So, why can't insurance just solve this problem? It's because no insurance company is going to write a policy for this length of time, because they have to be financially solvent. They have to have confidence that they're going to be able to cover their liabilities. We think that this is a little bit different because it's a physical liability, right? So in the event that the Permanence Trust's liabilities exceeded its ability to compensate for them, If it were an insurance company, it would go bankrupt. But if it's a trust, it just transparently says, oops, we got the calculation wrong. We're going to have to wait a little bit longer for our assets to grow before we can address those liabilities. And that's okay, because that scenario where you have, I'm making this up, 60 years of permanence, a 20-year gap, and then 1,000 years of permanence is better than the base case where you have 60 years of permanence and then you lose the storage, right? But people are going to have to accept that. And that leads me to the fifth, which is just market acceptance in general. Can this be written in to standards as an answer to sort of the like for like policies that are being developed? Will companies be willing to pay? If we succeed in our goal of effectively pricing permanence risks, are companies going to say, yeah, we'll pay the extra $5, $10, $25 per credit for that? So those are the things that keep me up at night right now. They constantly evolve. Whenever I read a new paper, it seems like there's a new thing to worry about. But absolutely, one of the things that Lynn said I most agree with is we do not want to leave anyone with the impression that we have this all figured out. And that's why we need the help of lots of people to refine this over time.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of speaking to that point of market acceptance, and as we think about all of these challenges, Lynn, how do we envision building kind of this broad-based buy-in across the range of stakeholders that we will need to engage for this to succeed?
Yeah, I'd say our first step hopefully is this webinar today, and we're just really grateful for everyone who's joined and listened in or checked out the paper. And yeah, all of those kind of invitations that I said about how to get involved, we genuinely mean that. Like every comment that we get back, every piece of feedback, whether it's praising the idea or telling us why it's not going to work, we sincerely want to hear that so we can design something that will work. And it could look different 6 months from now than what the paper looks like today, and we're totally okay with that. One thing I maybe didn't make clear in the presentation is that we do envision this as an independent market entity. So by that I mean not something that AFF is proposing to be the house of the Permanence Trust, not something that I think IC-VCM is intending to do either, but some sort of independent entity that would carry this forward. So what our hope is to do the work to see if it could be feasible, maybe get us to the stage of piloting it and just building out, iterating upon the concept. And then maybe if all of that goes well, which is a big if, then actually having that entity come into being sometime in the future. So lots of iteration to come, and sincerely invite all of you all, especially if you have expertise like in law and finance in some of these areas that we as a forest carbon project developer probably are lacking a little bit in, because we do focus on kind of the forest carbon and implementation side of things, standards, expertise, anything like that. We would really love your support, and just know that we definitely are open to any type of feedback and really invite that.
Great, thanks. And yes, I further encourage people to apply to the IC-VCM continuous improvement work programs, which can be found on our website, and the application for the continuation of the permanent CIWP is open and rolling. So please do apply if you're interested. So now we're going to jump right into the Q&A portion. I see there are some questions already in the queue, but if you have not put your question in, please put those into the Q&A function and we will try and go through and get to as many as we can. Okay, so starting off, this is kind of about reversals and definitions of reversals. Nate, one of your favorite topics. So I'll start with you. This one says, aren't roughly 80% of forest fires caused by humans? It says, how do you control for that? But I guess specifically speak to how does this Permanence Trust identify and move to addressing reversals of different types?
Yeah, I don't believe the trust would probably distinguish between what was man-made or what was not. At the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter what caused the reversal. The trust has to compensate for it. So yeah, so that's basically the answers. But it gets to that question of how do you model this? Like for example, do you say, well, as time goes on, surely we'll get better at teaching people not to start forest fires, therefore the risk is lower? Or do you go the opposite direction and say fire conditions are going to get worse and worse and worse, and so you'll see more destruction caused by that? And this is the real thorny problem about trying to price in risk over these time frames. So sorry, that's probably a really disappointing answer, but it's the sort of thing that we have to work through.
Right. And it goes to the point of covering the liability of the credit itself and covering for all different types of reversals, regardless of what caused them. Okay, the next is a bit more of a technical question. So have you had any discussion about whether that is the appropriate baseline in the permanence period? And should there be any consideration of what would have happened in the baseline scenario during the permanence period? So Lynn, I can direct this one to you, but feel free either of you to jump in.
Yeah, this is a great question. So yes, there's been some discussion, but I do think we need more, to Nate's point, that the definitions there are going to be really critical to how we would actually operationalize such a trust. And even in that FAO report that I screen shared, I think they define it with consideration of the crediting baseline scenario even into the permanence period. So that is a little bit different than how we've defined it. I'll say that the reason why we chose to use kind of that however much carbon is stored in the landscape scale project reservoir at the end of the crediting period as our baseline is that we're no longer issuing new credits once you're into the permanence period. So we didn't feel like continuing to demonstrate a level of additionality was necessary anymore if you're not going to be issuing more credits. It's more about maintenance of the already issued credits than issuing any new credits or continuing to go above and beyond in terms of building the carbon storage in that project landscape. So that was our thinking there, but certainly welcome more conversation on that.
Great, thank you. And so this next one is, so this is about, I think, that graph that you had put up in terms of the early situation of what would happen toward the end of the permanence period. But this is, how is the 1,000-year permanence liability fully retired at the end of year 100? It says, but it might mean 1,000, and they don't direct that to you.
No, so I think it does mean 100, and what that's referring to is those graphs. What we were trying to do is figure out at year 100, after a credit has been issued, given that along the way you've had to compensate for reversals, at that time, do you have enough money in the trust that you could buy permanent geologic storage credits for every remaining liability, right? So that's what we mean by it's retired. That theoretically you could take the amount of money in the trust and go and buy DAC credits or BEX credits or biochar or whatever. By the way, this is a whole topic of discussion, like what would count as permanent retirement. And therefore then you wouldn't have to monitor it anymore, right? By the way, if you did that, one of the benefits of this idea is in that project, some of those benefits would persist even though you had retired the liability, meaning that you're starting to have double counting work for you, right? In that we have the mitigation that we've paid for, which is persisting, and we've bought other mitigation to replace it, and so you're actually getting more mitigation than what was originally paid for. But that's what we mean by retiring the permanence. We don't mean to suggest that once you hit year 100, good enough, like we're done counting for it. We just mean that's the time period at which you could literally retire those liabilities through geologic storage under those assumptions, which have, I will say, probably an optimistic sense of the price of geologic storage at $150, which does go up by inflation, but for most people I've heard that probably needs to be raised.
That's helpful. So this one's more on the trust piece of things, but given has there been any thought put into what types of investment methods could be used for the permanence trust? i.e., could you invest in oil and gas companies and grow your investment? And if so, would that counteract a portion of your carbon benefit?
Lynn, if you're, I'll just take that one too. Yes, we have thought about that. So part of our work plan for that aspect of it, right, which is sort of like reserves management, is this question of what kind of ESG or carbon emission screens do you need to have on those investments, and how do they change over time? I don't think anyone involved would find it acceptable that the trust could just invest in whatever it wanted, regardless of the emissions profile. But do we have more details than that and what that would look like at this point? No, but it's a really good flag.
Yeah, so that's helpful. So going back to the permanence piece of things, Lynn, I'll ask this one to you. Could you dive a bit deeper on some of the assumptions and calculations that were made for the fund? For example, projects must only be permanent for 40 years, and the annual decay rate of 1% seems quite low for some of the nature-based projects. Can you just speak to some of the assumptions that went into those early calculations, and maybe how you see those iterating in this next process of the RFP?
Yeah, definitely. We do need to iterate on these some, but to some extent, they were just based on our experience so far. So American Forest Foundation does improve forest management and reforestation, and so we were kind of thinking about what time periods do we see as us being kind of that liable entity for the permanence of the credited benefits before it would make sense for us to pass it on to somebody else. With the kind of reforestation example, we just used 50 years as kind of a very, very general ballpark rotation age of forests. Obviously, that is extremely variable across different geographies and forest types. And then we did get some feedback from some experts in agricultural projects. And those, my understanding is that soil carbon agricultural projects tend to have a bit shorter landowner contracts than even some forest-based projects. So those were some things that we thought about. But yeah, a lot more to do there. And even just those three project types are kind of only skimming the surface of all the different project types that are out there. And so part of the work I think to do is bringing in more project types, as well as refining those ones that we even just took kind of an initial try at modeling out.
Okay, thanks. And Nate, I see you are typing a response for this one live, but I think this would be helpful maybe to ask to the wider group. And I see maybe you've already answered it, but speaking to the fund, is there a geographic basis for the permanence trust? So would there be multiple trusts covering multiple geographies? And how do you see this, operating differently in different places, i.e. the US versus the global South, for example, or other jurisdictions?
Yeah, we've had some brainstorming around this, and we have our own point of view, but it's something we're really going to have to assess. So, for one iteration of this idea is that there are like 1,000 permanence trusts. They're financial product offered by banks or insurance companies or other counterparties, and they're all kind of competing in the marketplace to offer this kind of service. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have, I think, our ideal, which is that there is one market-wide global permanence trust now, which is a non-profit entity. Right now, why one and why non-profit? Because ultimately, the owners of the permanence trust, right, the key shareholders and stakeholders are unborn generations, and so we feel the only legal mechanism to represent them and their interests is through that kind of structure. If it's in a for-profit, there's always going to be a conflict between shareholders and internal expectations and returns and so on and so forth. Similarly, global versus nation by nation, because the atmosphere itself is global, and ultimately that is determining whether these commitments are fulfilled to future generations, we think a global trust makes the most sense. Having said that, we have had people make cases to us to be better if it was structured this way or that way, or divided, and we're not at all opposed to that. That's I think one of the key design considerations we have to think through heading forward.
Okay. So kind of going back to earlier in your presentation, Lynn, when you spoke about some of the other proposed solutions, this question is, can you talk about why ton-year accounting wouldn't solve a lot of these permanence issues?
Yeah, good question. So to be honest, the number one reason that we thought about so far is just that it really hasn't been widely accepted as a permanence mechanism in the market. So there certainly have been very robust attempts at operationalizing tenure accounting, especially in the kind of forest project context. And yeah, it hasn't really been accepted as far as we've seen by many standards out there or buyers out there, unfortunately. So it didn't seem like a viable option to us. My understanding is that a lot of that does come down to sort of different interpretations or assumptions about equivalence ratios. So with tenure accounting, you're taking many short-term or even just 1 year long duration carbon credits. So you're only kind of making the claim that your carbon credit has a duration or a carbon storage of 1 year at a time. And then you're just getting a lot of those and you're adding them up to be equivalent to these much longer durations of carbon storage. And it's not, I don't think there's market consensus yet, I'll say, on what that equivalence ratio is. So how many of those ton-year credits do you actually need to stack to achieve something like millennia length permanence? That's pretty unclear. And then what if we later learn that that equivalence ratio was incorrect? There's not really a great mechanism for recourse after that. So that's what I hope is another benefit of the Permanence Trust is, yes, we have to make all of these assumptions and model these things out today to know how to price in the permanence to the credits. But like Nate said, even if we get it wrong, even if we're in the ballpark, the beauty of the fund is that it can be dynamic to things that we learn later because we'll have the money available to do different things that we might have anticipated doing up front. So that's something I like about it is it has that, the trust would have that mechanism for recourse, and it has sort of that dynamic long-term monitoring ability that I don't think is, or I haven't seen any of the ton-year accounting proposals so far.
Great, thanks. So clearly lots needs to happen before this becomes something that actually exists. But in the event that the Permanence Trust does get accepted, and now I just lost this question, but essentially it was about kind of at the implementation phase. So how would this work with project developers needing to partner with the Permanence Trust body, or how would it work in terms of that process, assuming that this does actually become a thing? I'll put that to you, Nate.
So in an ideal, the way we've thought about it today, and again, the only thing I know for sure is that this will change over the next 6 months, but our current thinking is that a project developer, when they issued a credit in conjunction with their standard, would declare a liability period, right? They would say, okay, we either individually as the developer or maybe jointly with the standard, we are on the hook for the permanence of this credit for however many years, right? And then based on that, the Permanence Trust runs an assessment of what the liability is beyond that period and translates that into a per credit fee that a developer would pay to the trust to effectively take over the liabilities after that period. And of course, our expectation is the developer would then roll that into the cost for the credits and the buyers would pay for it, right? Of course, we have to test that willingness to pay. The reason we want to do it like that is because it does give optionality to different types of projects, right? So you could have a project type that the developer is responsible for a very short period of time, here's the thing, that's going to cost more in terms of the assessment that they're going to have to make. Similarly, a developer might design a project that allows them to hold liability for a really long time, and that will decrease the assessment under the permanence trust. So part of our intention here, being developers ourselves, is to try and give multiple tools to developers, right? Everything from we're just going to outsource the permanent risk and make our buyers pay for it, to ooh, let's play around with the design of this project a little bit more to make the risk lower, to allow us to extend our own liability for it. And in that way, if you give a lot of creative people, which this market is full of, lots of design tools, but clearly a common framework, right, within which they have to operate, that's going to lead to the best outcomes, in our opinion.
Makes sense. And as we're coming up for the end here, we'll just take a couple more of these questions. But here's one. If the trust does experience temporary insolvency, how does it regain the solvency? And let's see, does it assume that the permanence trust will always be funded by carbon credit buyers?
In terms of solvency, so just let's say that we took liability for 100 credits that were just issued, and based on our model, those 100 credits would last 60 years and then they begin to decay. So let's say we get to 60 years and oops, 20 of them have already decayed, right? What the permanence fund would say is, all right, we got this wrong. What we're going to do is wait while our invested reserves, right, continue to grow in the marketplace until we're going to be able to address those liabilities. And there might be a gap there. This is a very simplistic example. In reality, it would happen across a wide portfolio of projects, and you'd have to have multiple instances where you had underpriced risk for there to be insolvency. But in that moment, what we're claiming is it's not really insolvency, right? Because it's not a financial liability that you're addressing with your resources. It's a biophysical liability. And so therefore, it's acceptable to go, okay, we didn't do this right. We're going to do it 20 years from now. By the way, you might also then use 10-year accounting to try and calculate what's the cost of that 20-year gap. We're going to hold ourselves accountable for that and buy more credits in year 21 in order to compensate for that gap. So that's our thinking there. Hopefully that's clear to everyone. Mikela, you are muted.
Sorry. We'll just have time for one more question, so I'll try and combine some of these. A lot are about the governance structure of this fund. So one is kind of speaking to, could maybe the independent programs or standards hold the liability and facilitate this type of fund? Or what does that kind of ideal governance structure look like for this fund to work and persist for the amount of time that we need it to?
Yeah, I can give a quick answer, which is, at least through conversations we've had so far with a few different standards on this approach, it doesn't seem desirable for standards to be the holders of the trust. Instead, I think the standards are perhaps more interested in making the trust an allowable mechanism for permanence, and then still having that sort of independent entity be the trust itself. Just because, like Nate was saying, like there is a really clear and specific and focused sort of mandate for the trust, which is to manage reversal risk and ultimately retire permanence liabilities. And that could be a little bit outside the scope of what standards and registries are most interested in doing. So yeah, open to other ideas on that, but we don't think standards, although certainly we'll need to work extremely closely with standards to sort of test this and make it happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn. And with that concludes this session. So thank you all for joining. And please do remember to apply for the CIWP on permanence with the IC-VCM if you're interested. And we will try and get to answering the rest of the questions that were in the queue that we were not able to answer today via email. So thanks all so much. Have a great day.